Christian parenting.
Welcome to the Living Wholehearted podcast. We are Jeff and Tara Matson, a husband and wife team who is shrinking the integrity gap in our own lives and helping others do the same. I'm a leadership and organizational development coach, and Tara is a licensed marriage and family therapist.
We believe that if you have a following, you are a leader, and how you lead matters. Whether you are leading in the home, work, or community, we are bringing you biblical, clinical, and relational wisdom to help you in every relationship that matters most to you. None of us do this perfectly, but we are leaning into the reality of our humanity and profound wisdom of grace. We've been bringing you stories of hope in the midst of darkness and talking about abuse. We really want to be able to process this at a deeper level. The impact of abuse is not only on the survivors, but on the entire system. We often don't talk about the issue, and we feel uncomfortable with this issue altogether. But today it's a necessary conversation that we're having. Jeff and I are really on mission to create healthier leaders and systems to heal our churches, our organizations, our families from abusive dynamics, from either us being perpetrators or being survivors. Wherever you're at in the journey, I don't want you to turn us off yet, because I bet you that there is something here that you'll resonate with and be able to connect with as we have a conversation with Pastor Joel Harris and writer-blogger Kimmy Harris. Welcome.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, good to be here.
Well, let me tell a little bit about you guys. I'll brag a little bit, but Joel and Kimmy, they've been together and are actually Portland, Oregon transplants and had moved to South Dakota. Joel's a pastor and a worship leader, and they have 3 little girls whom they homeschool. And as a family, they value the power of music and storytelling, and they love to share good books with each other. Kimberly has written for various publications, including Christianity Today and Crosswalk. She covers topics such as how abusers groom churches, biblical comfort in suffering, and empathy. And we'll share in the bio how you can find more about her writing as we move forward. So let's dive in. Why don't we just start, Joel and Kimmy, with just you guys. Tell us a little bit about your story, how you met, and what life is like for you today.
Yeah, our story is that we did, like you said, live in the Portland, Oregon area for really most of our lives. But we met in high school. I was maybe 15, Kimmy was 14, in church. So that's kind of the beginning of our story. We've had, quite a lot of different experiences and quite a journey since then. But we married. I was 21, and so it's been about 16 years.
Had to do the math, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that in our story, one of the things that has been a strong thread is, I think, for us learning how to navigate difficult situations together. I think we saw that even when we were both in high school. We became good friends, and I had a health scare when I was 16, and doctors thought that I might have cancer at that point. And so I actually still have sweet notes that Joel sent me during that time frame when there was real concern about not only my health, but also if I did have cancer, it would have been very advanced and serious. So our journey started early in God's kindness, where we found each other and became good friends early. And we got married early. And the Lord also brought different hardships and suffering that we had to navigate together. And so I think in our story, we've really seen how the Lord has brought us through those things together as a couple, and how that has shaped us, including in how we work together in the church and in Joel's ministry as a pastor as well.
Yeah. So Joel, how did you actually become a pastor? What brought you into pastoral ministries?
Yeah, sure. So when I was in high school, about the same time Kimmy and I met, I first started getting involved in leading worship. My dad planted a church And so I was really involved in worship ministry starting at that time, and then eventually ended up being opportunities for me to preach occasionally as well as I got a bit older. And so then eventually, just feeling more and more called to ministry and to pastoral ministry. Eventually, after Kim and I were married, went to Bible college and eventually seminary. Was able to continue to be mentored by pastors in particular at churches we were at. And then, it's just been a couple years ago that I was called out to this current church that we're at in South Dakota. That was after having finished up with seminary, kind of my first full-time ministry, full-time pastoral positions. And so, that's what kind of brought us where we are now.
Okay, so you're an official PK, pastor's kid.
That's right.
And have that in your roots. Okay, there's a lot with that. We can talk about that later. Kimmy, what about you when you think about your writing and what led you to be able to develop that skill and to be able to be where you're at today and sharing more in a greater audience?
I think in many ways, writing for me has been a surprise. I originally planned on spending more of my time on music. I taught music for years and years, and that's what I decided I wanted to do when I was in high school. And I do continue to love music. But I think I was in denial that writing was something that I was called to do and love to do as well. I was writing personally, just to sort through my own thoughts even and journaling. But I was also just any opportunity that I had to write in different ways, whether that would be emailing people, or sharing recipes. I just found myself writing a lot. And so it was only really, I would say in the last 5 years that I've really acknowledged that this was, part of my calling as a person. And through the Lord really opening doors for me, I was able to start writing for Christianity Today and other organizations. And in that just found it a really fulfilling way to share some of our own story and also be part of offering better information about sensitive topics. And so I think that really, again, it wasn't something that a lot of writers, they know from a really young age. That wasn't true for me. I was writing a lot personally, but wasn't really seeing it as a calling until more recent years. And then the Lord opened the doors at the right time for me.
Isn't that so true about, so often people think people just, were driven and they worked really hard to get there, but it was just a process of who you are. You were already writing in your journals or the recipes. And I loved how even God used Joel's writing to speak to you in a really difficult time. So writing's been a part that your words you're drawn to. Let's talk about why you write about abuse. Before we go there, abuse is it's a scary word for people just to even use that word. Sometimes we use it too flippantly and we need to be careful with that. But when we think about the different kinds of abuse, there's sexual, there's physical, there's emotional and spiritual, there's psychological, there's financial. There is a whole gamut of abuse. And sometimes we do call things that are just kind of humanity. We call that abuse, and other things that are completely 100% abuse. We kind of shrug off as if we all fall short of the glory of God kind of things. And we need to learn the difference between what is just our humanity and what is actual abuse. So why do you think it's so hard to talk about these topics, particularly in the church, and what has led you to talk about them?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think that one of the reasons we don't talk about abuse very much is because we don't understand what abuse actually is. And it's so true that there's so many different types of abuse that happens. One thing that I found really helpful in trying to sort through all of that is kind of going to the root of what abuse is, which Diane Langberg, who recently published a book called Redeeming Power, Understanding Authority and Abuse in the Church, she kind of talks about some of these different dynamics. But one of the things that she talks about in that book is how the word abuse comes from the Latin word beauty. I don't know if that's how you say it in Latin, but it comes from this Latin word that means to misuse or use wrongly. And she kind of talks about how there's different ways that looks, including things like injury, but also exploiting or offensive language or violence. And she says when a relationship is abusive in any form, the story being written is twisted and damaging. And I do think that we as Christians can struggle with understanding, because we recognize that all of us are sinful. And so we want to give grace to other people. But then, like you said, sometimes when there is a very serious abuse situation, we're giving grace to the wrong people. We're giving a grace to the wrong type of grace to the abuser, because that doesn't help the abuser, and minimizing the impact and sin against victims. So there are a lot of ways to abuse someone. But what you see is that there's this common thread where it's a misuse of power and authority. And I think that we need to first understand that abuse comes in many forms and is always damaging and sinful. And that while it's true that all of us have sin that separates us from God, and unless we have Jesus as our Savior, and that sin always brings division into our relationships, that it's also not true that all sin is equal in seriousness or equal in its impact. And I think that we can see that in our justice system. We understand that it's far more serious when someone murders someone else in comparison when someone steals a pack of gum. We understand that those are different types of crimes and they have a different impact. But you also really see that in the Bible, where where the Bible shows that there are different impacts, and that certain sins are more serious or offensive, or sometimes might be called detestable to God, is how it would be phrased. So when Jesus was rebuking the Pharisees, there's this clear implication that not all sins are equal. He refers to how they would strain out gnats, yet swallow a camel, kind of showing that both were wrong, but that they were not equal. And then also Jesus made this analogy that also implies the same thing when he's rebuking people for trying to get a speck out of someone else's eye while having a plank in your own. He's not saying that neither of those things are sins, but also showing again that one is a speck and one is a plank. And then the Old Testament has a lot of different examples showing that there is a difference between the impact of different actions and sins against each other. And so I think that it's important just to acknowledge that in our sinful humanity, we often do sin against each other, but it's really important to understand the differentiation between sins that need to be repented of and are common to all of us, and sin that goes into the territory of crime, such as sexual abuse, or in some cases, such as with serious spiritual abuse. There may be no laws broken there, but that the church has the responsibility to appropriately address that type of abuse. And so I think trying to understand some of those dynamics is really helpful, because I think that it can cause confusion if we are treating all sins as if they are equal, and it can make leaders feel uncomfortable with addressing abuse in their congregation or in the lives of those close to them. And so that's one thing. But also, Joel, you may have some thoughts too on why we don't feel comfortable addressing abuse.
Yeah. And I think in some ways there's almost an irony there, because as you were saying, sometimes the attitude is to try to say, oh, we all sin and all sin is kind of the same. And yet there is certainly a reality. And just at the level of our minds and our hearts, we know that things like sexual abuse and physical abuse are very serious and can be so harmful. And I think there's really an awareness. I think for myself, even from probably a young age, there's an awareness of the category of that type of abuse, and maybe you see it portrayed in a story or in a film or whatever, and yet also you really don't think that it happens to your best friend or one of your siblings or your child or your spouse, to people who are really close to you. And so I think there can just be a really big gap between our perception of something that's really horrible, but we don't think happens in our community, and the reality. And I think a lot of that is because it isn't talked about for various reasons, and obviously it can be really difficult for a victim to come out and share or disclose things like that. But because it's not talked about, and that's why I think some of the recent attention, even with things like Me Too, the Church Too movement, has been a really good thing. And even conversations like this one today, just because so many people, and including, I think, church leaders and pastors, often just really don't know how to respond properly. And sometimes I think just the natural instincts, which may have been shaped by a lot of different dynamics, but those instincts can just be really misguided and sometimes really harmful.
Yeah. So talk a little bit about your own, if you're willing, your own personal experiences with abuse in your own walk. Obviously, we're protecting other people's stories, but tell us more about your stories.
Yeah, so I think that, and for us, that I think that we really started grappling with this as a topic in a personal way, that also at the same time seeing how church and society in general was failing victims. And that was because I think that in our story, there was this really watershed moment that happened when Joel's brother, who was a pastor at a mega church, and this mega church was being publicly criticized for not handling abuse cases correctly. And some of those cases went back decades before, but we really wanted to understand what was going on and what was being said. So I ended up reading a lot of the stories coming out of that church denomination. And it was really through reading these stories that I was forced to deal with my own story. I think as someone who grew up in a stable family, who loved Jesus, I think I just had a lot of denial in my heart and in my mind that I had also been abused by people who were outside of my immediate family. And I did understand the more serious categories, such as rape, but I did not understand that sexual abuse was much broader than that. And I think that shows how little I knew at the beginning of trying to grapple with this topic. And so, but what that also meant, the way that I started grappling with my own story and being confronted by this very public situation, I was having to grapple with my own story at the same time that I was grappling with the bigger picture of how churches deal with sexual abuse. So I think that that was a lot to take on all at once. But not only that, that was kind of just the beginning for us, because in the upcoming months from that point on, we were to learn of many others close to us who were also abused and who often did not get support that they should have. Again, kind of underscoring just how there was a failure, not only in that there were abusers who were abusing people and had abused different people who we loved and cared for, but that also sometimes when they try to come forward, that they were not given the support or the resources they needed. And so that was a really, really painful time in a very personal way for us. And I do want to just acknowledge that that was very overwhelming to try to grapple with all of that, because it was not only my own story that impacted, my husband, who was walking alongside me in that journey, but that we were also having to face this sense of failure, where a lot of victims were not being able to find healing or to get community support in a way that would reflect what we would think biblical principles that would bring healing to victims. And in those early days, I also ended up having to make a police report. And that was, again, another really watershed moment for me, because the situation was a close friend was considering bringing legal action against two of her brothers for sexual abuse. And one of them had also sexually abused me as a child, but she had also disclosed abuse to me when we were teens about abuse that she was experiencing from another brother. And so I basically needed to make two separate police reports about that. And that was a really big deal to me, because this family was close to me and we had really deep roots together. And I think it demonstrated right from the beginning of our journey that trying to address this issue and to do the right thing is something that is costly, and it requires a certain strength to address it because of that cost. At that point in my life, I don't think I had grappled and healed from a lot of that abuse. And so it was a very hard step to make. But the thing that I really knew was, the Bible says that the truth will set you free. And I really had to trust that that was true, that it is always worth stating the truth. And so I did go ahead and make those police reports. And we did have to do that, even though we knew that many of our mutual friends and relationships from the church culture that we both attended back when we were teens, that we knew that there was many of those mutual friends who were really bitterly opposed to me coming forward and saying anything about what happened, let alone making police reports about it. And so, again, just to kind of talk a little bit about the cost of that, is we were in a position where just the very basic telling your own story was going to be a costly thing and open us up to a lot of pushback. And it did mean a loss of relationship. And it also meant doing that even if we didn't always have support from other ministry leaders that we knew who did not understand why that would be a necessary step. And so that could be a lonely journey too. And so I think that what we were grappling with is that there were abusers that were in our communities that weren't being held accountable for their actions, but there was also well-meaning people in our church and leaders that we admired and trusted who really didn't understand this topic. They didn't really know how to offer a biblical perspective on healing from abuse. And again, in wanting to desire to be helpful, would often say things that were not helpful or biblical and even really harmful. And that's one thing that I do wish that more pastors and ministry leaders would feel comfortable saying, is if a victim came forward, is just acknowledging that I don't understand this topic, but let's learn together what the Bible has to say on this topic and how you can heal. But often instead, there's a lot of incomplete information that they feel a little too secure in trying to share. And so that can muddy the water for victims in finding healing because of this incomplete or even wrong information they're giving. So in my story, I had to really find healing from a lot of that. And as a couple, that also meant that we had to grapple with what it meant to, at that point, Joel was, can't remember if you were maybe you're still in Bible school and maybe not seminary yet. Joel was in school. We knew that for being in ministry, we knew that was our future. But we were kind of grappling with this failure we were seeing in a very personal way in the church. And that's something that we still grapple with today, because there aren't easy solutions always to some of these problems, and change can be slow. But what we do see, what the Lord has done in our story, is that he has shown us the wealth and riches that there are in Scripture for us that offer so much hope and healing to victims. And that was so important to me because I did hear a lot of Scripture being misused and misapplied in a harmful way early on. It actually created this dynamic where it was hard for me to even read my Bible sometimes early on, because I would hear how those Scripture were kind of twisted and used against victims instead of their abusers. But eventually I was able just to see how the Bible actually has so much comfort and healing for victims, but also really strong terms against abuse. And so that was really healing for me to see, and gave so much hope and power of conviction too. And then he also, through all of these really difficult circumstances, taught us a courage that we didn't know we had. And that was through his strength in us, where we really had to learn how to stand for the truth, even when that was a lonely path. And I think that also we learned humility through that, because we were just able to recognize that sometimes mistakes are made in leadership when there's this pride of thinking I always know what the answer is. And so for us, for Joel going into ministry, we knew that we wanted to go into ministry knowing that we are human, that we also are prone to mistakes, so that we wouldn't enter feeling self-righteous towards other people, but that we would also have a strength of conviction because of our own story and what the Lord has brought us through, and feeling a faith that God could use our story and helping bring hope to those who have walked a similar path and not always gotten the support they needed, and that faith that God could use our story in helping other people.
Well, before we go to you, Joel, I just want to name so much wealth in there, and we're going to unpack a little bit more, Kimmy, but I hear the losses and the risk that it takes in being willing to seek help, to name first that there's abuse in your own story or in a system, means that there could be loss of relationships, loss of a sense of your own identity and story and narrative, and having to reframe that. There's a lot of possibilities of being kind of seen as causing waves, and well-meaning people trying to come alongside and twisting things that you end up losing a lot, and yet you're clung to the truth, that the truth will set you free. And you can see now, years later, some of the redemption that's happening is you're able to have compassion and empathy in ways for people in your own wake of influence as leaders. And it's kind of given you a perspective of being a humble leader that's willing to admit that you don't always know, or that you might have messed up, and trying to take that posture as you go and shepherd others. Joel, what would you add to that as you look back? Anything else that you saw as a consequence or a loss as you had to face the abuse, not only in Kimmy's story, but in this in the whole community?
Sure. Yeah, no, I think definitely like Kimmy and even you have mentioned, there have been sometimes a loss of relationships, or certainly a strain on relationships in some cases. I think one of the other things that I think we both have experienced through some of this is just there can be a certain, especially as you're younger, an idealism, maybe a certain type of respect and kind of looking up to different leaders where, maybe just not having a realistic view of that they're human and that they don't have all the answers to everything. And so seeing people who were maybe in some ways heroes disappoint you, misstep, end up even maybe saying or doing hurtful things. And again, not even talking about, leaders who would be abusing or perpetrators in any sense, but just in terms of handling these kinds of situations, or even trying to counsel victims or people who are walking through that. Just there's a certain disappointment, and there's a certain maybe disillusionment. And that's just something I think for any Christian having to come out on the other side of that and still understand that doesn't reflect who Jesus is, who God as our Father is, and that He's greater, and we can continue to trust in Him even when people and in those who are supposed to be shepherds and protectors may let us down. So that's certainly been something that we have had to work through and just deal with. And I guess on the flip side of that, what's been encouraging, maybe two things. One is just knowing that as we see healing that's been able to happen personally for Kimmy and for others that we know, and as the right actions or the right truths are spoken, just seeing the good and the growth that can come through that, and just knowing that Jesus, His heart is with the broken and the wounded and the hurting, and that if in whatever ways that we're able to encourage or speak truth or comfort into those situations, that He's with us, and that that's where His heart is as well. That's something that I think we've sensed and just found comfort in. And then also I've just noticed for myself, especially now, being a pastor, how meaningful it can be in ways that I guess I kind of view as relatively small and kind of insignificant with my limited influence. But just as a pastor and as a man, if I share something, even just on social media, or share something that Kimmy's written, or try to use my voice just to speak on these issues, how meaningful that can be to victims, how meaningful that can be to women who are maybe used to hearing maybe another woman talk about these things, or try to bring attention to it. But just for me, in whatever way I can, just seeing that it can be significant to folks out there, and just the importance of trying to help, and to be a part of bringing more light, more truth, and just helping people grow in their understanding of these things.
That's beautiful, Joel, because you're recognizing the God-given power that a pastor and shepherds are given in the church, and just when you say something versus someone else, and that is true on both ends, whether it's adding to the abusive system or it's bringing healing and redemption. And so thank you for that point, because I think that's a really important point, that this isn't an issue for those people over there. It's an issue for everyone. All of us need to be a part of restoring the power in God's economy. So we're going to close up part one and pick up this conversation. We're going to dive deeper into your healing journey, how you went from kind of that naive place you were talking about of just, loving Jesus and loving each other, to a groundbreaking collision where you realize there's a lot of hurt and pain and sexual abuse going on, to even having a hard time reading the Bible, to continuing to shepherd and to love Jesus and to love His bride. I think that's an amazing story. And I think there's questions saying, okay, so how does that happen? So let's talk about that more in part two. Before I close, I want to speak to our audience and just say that if you are in a place where you have been abused and you haven't gotten help, today's the day. Pick up the phone, find a counselor, lean into a friend or a mentor that's safe to start there, and they'll help you in the journey. You can go to livingwholehearted.com, and we've got some resources for you there. You might pick up with just a book if you're a leader or someone who's just trying to understand what's healthy versus unhealthy. We've got Shrinking the Integrity Gap Between What Leaders Preach and Live. We talk quite a bit about abusive systems and healthy systems in there. And we've got Steve Tracy's book, Mending the Soul, and Celestia Tracy's workbook, Mending the Soul. Both are good resources for you. I would check those out. And to know that the unique thing about sexual abuse is that it often covers all the abuses. If there's sexual abuse, there is emotional abuse. And if it's in the church, there is spiritual abuse attached to that, and physical abuse. And so it's just it's a messy web, and it takes time and intentionality to heal. It doesn't just go away. And so I'm encouraging you to lean in, to have the courage to ask for help, as Kimmy and Joel have alluded to. So we are here to walk with you. And until next time, we pray that we would all be a part of shrinking our own integrity gaps, that we would add to the health of the church, that those of you who aren't a part of a church because of these issues wouldn't give up, and knowing that there are healthy leaders and healthy systems still available. Thank you, Kimmy and Joel, for being willing to be so vulnerable and to use your voices to help others today.
Thanks, Tara.
This podcast is powered by Living Wholehearted, Courageous Girls, and the Christian Parenting Podcast Network. Thank you for joining us in this critical movement of shrinking our integrity gaps between what we preach and live.